Now, Bert, you've been studying emerging markets for decades. You've written extensively about it. Kevin's painting a very rosy scenario, but I'm wondering, we've got excited about emerging markets before. Remember what was going on in the 1990s in Thailand and Malaysia, of course. There were a lot of China bulls 10 years ago that have since cooled on China. So we'll sort of play this out for us. What are your thoughts on this right now?
I think, Bob, it's instructive to look at China. And India is in some sense where China was 20 years ago. China had Deng Xiaoping, who was introducing capitalism into China. And there was this pivot from the extreme socialism of Mao. And there was terrific demography because 20 years ago, China had a young population. It had almost 10 people of working age for every retired person. And the interesting thing is what derailed China was that both of those things have changed now. For one thing, Xi Jinping is far more like Mao than Deng Xiaoping. There's centralized control. He's tough on private firms and wants the central economy, the central government to control the whole economy. And the demography has seen a sea change. The one-child policy, which is now over, but fertility rates have remained very low. China, which used to have one of the youngest populations in the world, is now in about the situation that the U.S. is in, not as bad as Europe and Japan, but China is aging tremendously rapidly. And by 2050, China will be worse than the United States, about the same as Europe, and almost as bad as Japan. So China is not growing anymore. India's population is growing at 1%. It's young, and as Kevin has said, it's tech savvy. There's a reverence for education. There's hard work. There's a work ethic. They speak English. They've got all of these kinds of things going. And what I think is not likely to happen, at least not for decades, is that if you look at India's demography 10 years from now and 15 years from now, it'll still look good. They're going to be aging, but they've got such good demography now that even 15 years from now, it will still look good. Now, what could derail them? Investing has got a lot of risks. There are ethnic tensions in India. The Modi government could be replaced. But what is unlikely to happen is what happened in China. That is to say, it's unlikely to go into a dictatorship situation because India is still the largest democracy in the world. And as long as the democracy changes, yes, you could have a less favorable government, but I don't think you're going to see the things that derail China.
So you're making a very good point. The problem with China is, number one, demographics are moving against them. But more importantly, I think your point about communism. I know 10 or 15 years ago, those of us who were watching the international investing community, we were all thinking of Xi Jinping as the new Deng Xiaoping. It was sort of gentle state communism a la 1970s. And what we got instead was Xi Jinping as Mao Zedong, as you said, which has killed the capitalists. Nobody signed on for that, and I think that's part of the problem international investors now have. We're not getting with what we thought we were getting at this point, and you think this is very unlikely to ever happen in India. That's your point here, right?
Not in a democracy, and you can see it even within the Chinese economy. One of the reasons the Chinese economy has slowed down is a central government. A dictatorship can make all kinds of mistakes that are harder to make in a democracy. For example, in COVID, Xi Jinping shut down the entire entire economy. They also have not let the market direct where investment goes. They have deliberately increased the real estate sector so much now that you have the Evergrande type problems where so much money was put into real estate that it's created bankruptcy problems. And again, that's where I think the whole economy has just been in part undone. Now, look, I don't think this is the end of China. The IMF forecasts are that India will grow at 6 or 7% over the next 5 or 6 years, and they still think China will grow at 3 or 4%. So I'm not saying China's totally uninvestable, just forget about it. But clearly, all the advantage today is with India. And sure, there are risks, but these are risks that I suspect are very much worth taking.
Very compelling argument on India versus China. Todd, I want to bring you in here. Give us your perspective on international investing in 2023. You know, what strikes me looking at the U.S. did okay. Latin America, Mexico, and Brazil, on a price basis, did okay. Europe did okay, but the flows were very anemic. There didn't seem to be a lot of enthusiasm for investing in Europe. And because China was a poor performer, Asia was generally a poor performer in general. So your thoughts on this and on India?
If I could back up to what Kevin and Professor Malkiel said, that with their idea between going towards India, loosening up on China, speaks to a big theme here, which is EMX China, right? The product launches have accelerated. You have every issuer now coming out with an EM without the China exposure. FRDM is an important one, launched a few years ago. And I think that makes sense. That would mean India should be the beneficiary of any allocators going into those types of products. And the flows are really picking up because China has, frankly, been investors in the butt here over the last decade or so.
What they're both talking about is greatly increased political risk in China.
Yeah.
To defang the arguments here, and poor decision-making from a centralized planning and all that. But political risk is much higher than we thought it was going to be because we didn't get the Xi Jinping we thought we were going to get.
Yeah, exactly. And it's way too big of a weight within the EEM right now, right? It's still almost 30%. That's way too much. And there's over 50 China ETFs right now. I think that's a huge product imbalance. We don't need that many China ETFs.
Yeah, it's confusing.
It's very confusing. You have 8 shares, A shares, right? And so I think it's way easier just to look at all the other countries around there, Korea, Taiwan, and India. It's a much simpler vanilla play.
So your point is that the promulgation of indexes and ETFs globally, emerging markets, Asia, Pacific, ex-China, is the proliferation of that ex-China is a sign that investors are increasingly concerned.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And the flows to ex-China type products prove that, too. You're getting model portfolio inflows to the EM ex-China plays.
Yeah.
As for Europe, Europe's always a rug pull, right? It outperforms at different times throughout the year. Earlier this year, it outperformed. You had pretty good inflows, and then they all came out in the back half of the year as it became kind of the same old story. But what I do think is interesting about Europe is it's a much different constituency set than the U.S. It's a lot more industrial and financial heavy. And this is the first time I can remember where we're talking about recessions and economic issues, but it doesn't involve European financial stocks. And those are actually holding up pretty well here. So maybe this does create a nice little 2024 setup for that region.
Kevin, India seems to be the beneficiary of companies that are trying to diversify their supply chains out of China. How far along is that? We often talk about Apple seeking to move along, but there's other companies as well who are trying to do that.
Well, I think that's very early, I think, still. The reality is that, yes, Apple has started to ramp up production in India, but its target is a lot higher. I think that they plan on having about 25% of the iPhones to be made in India by 2025. So that's definitely happening. But, India needs to continue to invest in the infrastructure because that's, the reason everything's made in China is because China built the world's best infrastructure to make products and get them onto a boat and off around the world. And India has made great strides in the last decade in its infrastructure, but it's got a long way to go, especially in port capacity.
Yeah. So, Bert, would you agree? Development of infrastructure is the key to keeping this going. I'm assuming the political risk is on the level we think it is now, that nothing untoward is going to happen, as you mentioned there. Other than that, what else is out there? It seems to me like supply chain and building infrastructure is, as Kevin said, is the key point here.
No, there's no question about that. And it will happen. It may happen more slowly than many people might like, but I think they realize that that is what is needed. And I think that that's going to be part of the growth story over the next decade. And I think it will happen. And I think that, let's just take, it's very hard predicting the future. The IMF has not had too bad a job. And as far as their economists are concerned, there will be this growth of something like 6 or 7% real economic growth versus 3 or 4 for China, about 1 for the U.S. and Europe, and Japan losing a third of its population and stagnating. And I think those are probably the most reasonable expectations. They'll undoubtedly be wrong, as economists always are. But I think the general look at economies around the world, I would certainly put my money on India being the major economy with the best growth prospects.
And I just want one last turn back to politics for either one of you, Bert or Kevin. Modi keeps trying to steer this middle ground. He keeps saying that he's neutral. Kevin, when I was talking to you on the phone, you were joking to me that Modi is one of the only people in the world who can buy all the Russian oil he wants and still get invited to a White House dinner. I think that's actually true. So are you assuming then that Modi's going to continue to maintain a neutral stance? A lot seems to depend on how well he sort of places them. They're perfectly placed globally, economically, but again, a lot of this, what we saw with China, political risk can get very high here.
Well, look, as Modi has said, he's on the side of peace first and foremost. So, I think that it's unlikely that that's going to change. They are running the country like a business now, and I think he's hyper-focused on continuing that. And if you look at the progress they've made in simplifying the tax code, cutting out a lot of the challenges and paperwork that were, not very business-friendly, the country has come a long way, and it's entering this really golden age. And you talk about the economic growth that's going to happen, but that digital growth that's going to happen, maybe 500% in the next 7 or 8 years, according to most estimates. So it's the internet story that's going to be the big part of this.